Getting ready for Christmas parties is something we're all doing this time of year, but imagine if you were hosting one, which I know some of you are, and you found out that a distinguished guest was coming, an auspicious guest, someone who would be immediately recognized, like a president of the United States or a movie star or some famous athlete. I don't know about you, but I'd be a nervous wreck getting the house ready, getting all the right guests to come. Well, that's exactly what the texts are talking about in Haggai, in Malachi, and the text the choir has sung before this morning in Handel's Messiah. It's an absolutely amazing text because what it's talking about is the auspicious guest who is coming, the coming of the Messiah. And some people prepare way ahead of time for a party like this. My grandma Corey used to do that. I lived with her after my grandpa died. Back in the late 50s, I lived with her for my 3 of 4 years in college, and we had a great time, a lot of fun together. And I remember coming home from school one day, and I was walking through the dining room, and I saw everything set beautifully on the table, the silver service, the crystal, the china, the cloth napkins. And I said, "Grandma, are you going to have a party?" "Yes, I am. It's a dinner party." I said, "Oh, that's great. Is that tonight?" "No, next week," because she liked to plan ahead. Now, my grandpa told me when I was younger and he was still living that they lived in a room where they had separate twin beds. And he said to me that if I get up to go to the bathroom or to get a drink of water in the middle of the night, I'll come back and find my bed made. You liked that one, didn't you? So that was my grandma Corey. She always prepared way ahead of time. And that's what this text in Malachi is talking about, the text that the choir has sung this morning. It's a beautiful text. Malachi is a beautiful prophet. There's something hidden in code in his name in Hebrew. Malach means angel or messenger, and putting the I on the end creates the first personal pronoun, my. So what Malachi's name means is my messenger, my angel. It's a beautiful name. It was used a lot in England during the Protestant Reformation. In this country in the 1880s up till about 1911. Then it goes out of disuse until the 1990s. I don't know what happened then, but lots of families started naming their children Malachi in the 90s and in the 2000s. Malachi is a name used in James Joyce's famous novel Ulysses when he calls one of his characters Malachi Mulligan. Kurt Vonnegut uses this name in his second novel as the protagonist, Malachi Constant. It's a name that says, my messenger. And so this is God's personal messenger, and it's a messenger who needs some help with his people skills because he's constantly barking orders in 3 ways: shaking, burning, and building. And these words form the points of the sermon this morning: shaking, burning, and building. First of all, shaking. Like the wedding planner in Steve Martin's movie, The Father of the Bride, this messenger is shaking everybody up and scaring everybody. And that's what happens with this text. As this bull in a china shop messenger presents the message of the Lord of hosts says, I will shake the heavens and the earth, the sea and the dry land. I will shake the nations in a way they have never been shaken before, which means you better get ready. You shouldn't be doing something you are not supposed to be doing when this guest arrives. You better not watch out. You better not cry. You better not pout. I'm telling you why. Someone important is coming to town. So first we have this shaking, like earthquakes. Now, I've never lived through an earthquake, but I've heard they're really awful. How many of you have lived through an earthquake? Just go ahead, show of hands. Yeah, a couple of Californians here. After the early service, someone said, we had a little tremor here in Birmingham 10 years ago. Some of you may remember that. Earthquakes are a challenge. Several years ago, a search committee from a church in San Francisco called trying to recruit me. The problem was they called the day after a big earthquake. I said, "Your timing is terrible." I said, he said, "We only had a few paintings fall off the wall here." I said, "I'm looking at my paintings and they're completely straight where I am right now." A PBS radio show had a whole program on which is the worst, earthquakes, hurricanes, or tornadoes. You ever heard that debate before? Which is the worst? And maybe you have in your mind which would be the worst. And someone called in, a man called in who'd lived through all three of them. And the host said, "Oh, this is great. We can settle the debate. You've lived through, you survived earthquakes, hurricanes, and tornadoes." He said, "Yes, all three." He said, "That's amazing. Now you can tell us which one's the worst." And the man replied, "Whichever you're in at the time, that's the worst one." You see, the Lord of hosts says, "I will shake the heavens and the earth. I will shake the sea and the sky. I will shake the nations in a way they have never been shaken before." And what the prophet is describing and Handel is demonstrating in both word and song is that the arrival of this guest will be so cosmic and so cataclysmic, it will shake everything. It will be a commanding, this guest will be a commanding presence when he comes. Stephen Ambrose, in his book, To America, describes what a commanding presence Thomas Jefferson always was. He says that when Jefferson walked into a room and sat down at a table, the place where he sat became the head of the table. That was the presence of Thomas Jefferson. And what the prophet Malachi and what Handel, with Charles Jennings' help as the librettists, are trying to help us understand is that this guest, this Messiah who is coming, will have that kind of commanding presence. He will shake the foundations of everything in our very lives. So first of all, we have the shaking. Second, we have the burning. Harvard historian George LaPiana says that every religious movement usually goes through three stages: the ethical, the theological, and the aesthetic. It starts with a moral reform and then progresses on to a reflective formulation on faith and practice, and finally elaborates its theology in the beauty and the loveliness of its architecture, its buildings, and its liturgy. But first is the upheaval, the shaking. Think about the history of Independent Presbyterian Church. It began with an upheaval. It began with a shaking, the decision to leave South Highland Presbyterian Church and go across the street to Temple Emmanuel to recapture our Jewish roots, and then eventually move to this place where we are here almost 100 years ago. It began with that shaking, that upheaval, but then in 1992, there was the burning. And many of you lived through that and watched this edifice next door go to the ground, or nearly in many cases. The burning comes after the shaking. And the burning says to us that we need to be prepared for the one who comes like a refiner's fire. Who may abide his coming, says Malachi, and sung the soloist just a moment ago. Who may abide his coming, for he is like a refiner's fire. Which means that we need to prepare for the coming of the Messiah, not at the end, that this is the end time, like Tim LaHaye's series Left Behind. No, for right now, Haggai, Malachi, and Handel want us to understand that our preparation for the coming Messiah is here and now, because he is coming like a refiner's fire. Paul talks about this in his passage that I just read a moment, with his fiery statement about the burning that will come with the Messiah. Several years ago, I was a missionary for a short period in India, and I remember being in Papanaseri on the western toward the bottom of the western coast, of the bottom tip of India. And the pastor wanted me to see where many of his parishioners worked in a big company that made bricks. And we got very close to the unbelievable temperature of the bricks being fired. And it made me realize that there are times in our lives when God fires us that is almost like a burning, whether it's the death of a loved one or a loss of a job or this tragedy or that. And when our faith is strong, then we are able to withstand whatever comes our way. So we begin with the shaking, then the burning, and then finally there is the building where God rebuilds us. God puts us back together. And we are not the same as we were before. Every great novel you read or every great movie or play you see will have major characters who go through character arcs. They start at one place and they end up in a different place. Well, this happens throughout the Bible. Warren Lightfoot just told us about it in his wonderful presentation on St. Peter. St. Peter started at one point, but in the presence of the Christ who will be the risen Christ, he becomes a different person. You and I become new persons altogether. That's part of Advent. We are to repent of how we are living. God has gathered us together to do what God is calling us to do for the kingdom. And so God is making us, through Advent, new persons altogether to prepare for the coming of the Messiah. And it happens faster than you think. Think about how quickly Handel wrote Messiah himself. Around 3 weeks. That's amazing, this masterpiece. And we have 3 weeks before the big Christmas party that we will celebrate in this place on Christmas Eve and on Christmas morning, because it is a Sunday morning, and I expect to see all of you here at 11 o'clock on that Sunday morning. You can come dressed more casually, but this is going to be the party, the Christmas party of a lifetime. And we are called upon to gather as God's people. We get a foretaste of that Christmas party as we share today the food and drink on this table. After the first performance of Messiah, someone ran up to Handel and said, "Oh, you really entertained us tonight." And Handel frowned and said, "Then I have failed, because my goal was to make you better." The same is true today. The music is gorgeous. The experience of being here together is amazing. But if you have only been entertained this morning, then the clergy and the choir have failed. We have not done our jobs. Our goal is to be a conduit of God's message to you and to me, to be better persons, to be new persons altogether because of the Messiah, the one we call the Christ. To him be all honor and glory and blessing and praise from this day forth and forevermore. God bless you all.